The summons arrived 3 days after they discharged us, delivered by a servitor whose Vox grill leaked static that smelled like burnt insulation. I remember the texture of the parchment, rough, gray, stamped with the twin-headed aquila, and how my fingers left sweat marks on the corners even though the barracks were cold enough to see your breath. The letter used the word reassignment 17 times, but never once explained where or why. We'd held the trench lines for 11 months. 11 months of shelling, of watching the sky burn green with chemical munitions, of counting the hours between supply drops that came later and later until they stopped coming at all. When the enemy finally withdrew, or maybe they just decided we weren't worth the ammunition, there were 43 of us left from a regiment that had deployed at 2,000 strong. They marched us back through the ruins of the hive city we'd been defending, past streets choked with rubble and the stink of unburned dead, and I thought, we survived. They gave us new fatigues, hot rations for the first time in months, and told us to wait for demobilization orders. I should have known better. The Imperium doesn't waste resources, and 43 veterans with proven endurance qualify as resources. The reassignment facility was 40 kilometers north, in what used to be a manufacturing district before the war turned it into a landscape of twisted girders and collapsed smokestacks. They loaded us onto a cargo hauler at dawn. No windows, just bare metal benches and a single loom strip that flickered every few seconds. Nobody spoke during the ride. Corporal Venn sat across from me, staring at his hands. He'd lost 2 fingers on his left hand to frostbite in the 3rd month, and he kept rubbing the stumps like he was trying to remember what they'd felt like. Next to him, Trooper Halleck was crying silently, tears tracking through the grime on her face. She'd stopped sleeping after the night bombardment in week 26, the one that collapsed half our trench system and buried 30 men alive. The medic had given her stims to keep her functional. I don't think she'd closed her eyes since. The hauler stopped with a hydraulic hiss, and they herded us out into a courtyard surrounded by prefabricated bunkers and chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. And the sky was the color of old bruises, and the wind carried ash that settled in your hair, your collar, the creases of your knuckles. A functionary in a gray uniform stood on a raised platform holding a data slate. He didn't look at us while he read the orders. We were to be processed for labor reassignment. Duration, indefinite. Appeals, not permitted. Refusal, punishable under military code. Subsection 12. Clause 47. Desertion in time of continued crisis. But the war's over, someone said. I think it was Venn. The functionary finally looked up. His face was soft, unlined, the kind of face that had never missed a meal or slept in frozen mud. The war is never over, he said. Your service continues. They separated us by specialty. Venn and the other veterans with combat engineering experience went north, to the munitions works, they said, to assist with production quotas. Halleck and the scouts went east, to the surveyor teams mapping contaminated zones. I ended up in a group of 15, all of us former line infantry with medical flags for psychological resilience markers. They told us we were being sent to Facility 17, a research and containment installation beneath the old hive spire. They told us it was an honor to serve there. They told us nothing else. The transport to 17 took 6 hours, descending through access tunnels that hadn't been maintained in decades. The walls wept moisture that left orange streaks on the rockcrete, and the air grew thicker the deeper we went, heavy with recycled breath and the tang of oxidized metal. And the other reassignments sat in silence, faces blank, and I wondered if they'd all learned the same lesson I had. Questions changed nothing. The Imperium moved like a glacier, crushing whatever lay beneath it, and we were just grit caught in the ice. Facility 17 occupied 5 subterranean levels carved into the bedrock beneath the hive's foundations. The entrance was a blast door 3 meters thick, guarded by soldiers in hazard suits whose rifles tracked our movements as we filed past. Inside, the air was filtered and cold, stripped of moisture, and every surface was enameled white under buzzing loom strips that turned skin the color of corpses. A woman in a gray smock and augmetic eyes greeted us in the processing bay. Her voice was flat, synthesized, like she was reading from a script burned into her brain. "You have been selected for custodial and observation duties within classified research parameters," she said. "Your prior service records indicate sufficient mental conditioning to withstand operational stressors. You will be briefed on a need-to-know basis. Failure to comply with protocols will result in immediate termination. Medical assessments begin in 10 minutes. They stripped us, examined us, cataloged every scar and broken bone and lingering injury. A tech priest with 12 fingers, 6 organic, 6 augmetic, scanned my skull with a device that whined like a dying animal and left my teeth aching. He noted something on his data slate, made a gesture I didn't understand, and waved me through to the next station. And they issued us new uniforms, gray coveralls with rubberized seals at the wrists and ankles, and mag-locked ID tags that hung cold against the sternum. Mine read, Reassignment 7743-V, Clearance Amber-3. Assignment, Observation Wing Sublevel 4. Sublevel 4 smelled wrong. Not rotten, not chemical. Something else. Something that made the hindbrain scream. It was the smell of a room where something had been alive and then wasn't, but the transition had taken a long time. The corridors were narrow, lined with reinforced doors every 20 meters, each one stenciled with numeric codes and biohazard warnings. My supervisor was a man named Proctor Dulaine, gaunt and hollow-eyed, with a tremor in his left hand that he tried to hide by keeping it in his pocket. He walked me to my station and explained the routine in a voice that never rose above a whisper. You observe. You record. You do not speak to the subjects. You do not acknowledge the subjects. If a door begins to malfunction, you report it immediately. If you hear anything unusual, you report it immediately. If you see anything that wasn't there before, you report it immediately. Do you understand? I nodded. Good, he said, and handed me a data slate and a chronometer. Your shift is 12 hours. There's a relief station at the end of the corridor. Water, ration bars, latrine access. Stay at your post. Do not wander. Do not investigate sounds. Do not open any doors unless explicitly ordered to do so by someone with clearance crimson or above. He paused, and for the first time his eyes met mine. They were exhausted. And do not let them see you hesitate. My post was a monitoring station outside cell 47. A narrow desk, a stool bolted to the floor, a slate displaying vital statistics I didn't understand. Heart rate, respiration, neural activity, all fluctuating in jagged peaks and valleys. A small window, 30 centimeters square, set into the door at eye level, covered by a metal shutter. I sat down, logged my ID, and began the first shift. The first hour was silence. The second hour was silence. The third hour, I heard something scraping against the inside of the door, soft, rhythmic, like fingernails on steel. I checked the slate. Heart rate, elevated. Respiration, shallow. Neural activity, spiking. I made a note in the log. The scraping continued for another 40 minutes, then stopped. At hour 5, someone screamed further down the corridor, a high, warbling sound that cut off abruptly. Nobody came to investigate. I kept my eyes on the slate. At hour 7, the shutter on my door rattled. I froze. The protocols said not to acknowledge the subjects, not to open the shutter unless ordered. But the rattling grew louder, more insistent, and I heard a voice from inside the cell. It was hoarse, cracked, but still recognizably human. Please, it said. Please, I just want to see. Just once. Please. I stared at the shutter. My hand hovered over the release latch. The voice continued, rising and falling, sometimes begging, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing in jagged bursts that sounded like choking. The slate showed neural activity climbing into the red zone. I wrote it down. The voice went on. By hour 9, I understood why Dulaine's hand shook. The shift ended. I filed my report, returned to the dormitory level, and lay on a cot that smelled like disinfectant and someone else's sweat. Around me, other reassignments slept or pretended to sleep. Nobody spoke. In the dark, I could still hear the voice from Cell 47, looping through my memory like a broken recording. The second shift was worse. The third shift, worse still. They rotated us between cells, but it didn't matter. Every cell held something that had been human and was becoming something else. Cell 19 contained a woman who spoke in languages I didn't recognize, syllables that made my ears itch and my vision blur at the edges. Cell 63 held a man who hadn't moved in 6 days, whose vitals remained steady, even though his eyes had turned black and wept a substance the slate labeled unidentified proteinaceous discharge. Cell 81 was empty, but the walls were covered in handprints, dozens, hundreds, overlapping until they formed a pattern that hurt to look at directly. I asked Dulain what they were researching. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned away without answering. By the third week, I'd learned the rhythm of the facility. The morning shift brought new subjects, delivered by tech priests and servitors, strapped to gurneys and sedated into silence. The evening shift removed the dead, sealed in black polymer bags and carted away to the incinerators on sub-level 5. The night shift was observation only, 12 hours of sitting in the buzzing silence, watching the slates, listening to the sounds behind the doors. Some of us started to crack. A reassignment named Corvin tried to open cell 22 during his shift, said he heard his daughter's voice inside, said she was calling for him. They dragged him away before he could breach the seal. I never saw him again, but I heard the rumors. He'd been reclassified to subject status, moved to a cell on sub-level 3. I stopped asking questions after that. The fourth week, they showed us the observation theater. Dulain gathered a dozen of us in a chamber overlooking one of the larger containment cells, a space 10 meters square, entirely featureless except for the drains set into the floor. A subject was brought in. A man, middle-aged, with a shaved head and a numeral tattooed on his forearm. He was conscious, restrained in a chair at the center of the room, and he was screaming. Not words, just sound. A figure in sealed environment armor entered the cell, carrying a case of instruments I couldn't identify. The observation theater's speakers crackled to life, and a voice, clinical, dispassionate, began narrating the procedure. I won't describe what they did. I won't describe how long it took, or what the subject became by the end, or the way the drains couldn't handle the volume of fluid and it began pooling on the floor, dark and viscous. I will say this. When it was over, Dulain told us we'd done well not to look away. He told us that understanding required witnessing. He told us we were serving a purpose greater than ourselves. I threw up in the latrine after the briefing and stared at my reflection in the tarnished steel mirror. My face looked thinner, older, yet like the last month had carved 10 years into my skull. I thought about the trench lines, about the bombardments and the cold and the bodies piled in no man's land. And I realized I'd been wrong. The war hadn't ended. It had just moved underground and changed its uniform. 5th week. I stopped counting shifts. Time blurred into a sequence of slates and voices and doors that rattled in the night. I learned the names of the other reassignments on my rotation. Savik, Aurel, Mayan, Kess, but I didn't speak to them unless necessary. Speech felt dangerous, like it might crack the shell of numbness I'd built around myself. Savik disappeared one morning and nobody mentioned it. Aurel started laughing during a shift, high and manic, and they sedated him and carried him away. Mien began scratching marks into her forearm with a broken stylus, on tiny tally marks that climbed toward her elbow. Kess just stared, eyes fixed on nothing, and refused to eat. I kept working. I observed. I recorded. I did not ask what the research was for, or why the subjects were chosen, or what happened to the data I logged every shift. I did not open the shutters. I did not speak to the voices behind the doors, even when they begged in accents I recognized, even when they knew my name. They knew my name. Cell 47 again, 6th week. The same hoarse voice, but different now, steadier, clearer. It called me by name. It described the barracks on the trench line, the way the wind sounded at night, the taste of the rations. It knew things only someone who'd been there could know. I checked the intake logs. Subject 47 had been transferred from the munitions works, flagged for behavioral deviation, on unfit for labor duties, reclassified for research purposes. The name on the file was Corporal Venn. I sat at my post, hands shaking, and stared at the shutter. The voice behind the door kept talking, kept pleading, kept describing memories we'd shared. My hand moved toward the latch. I stopped it. I wrote in the log, Subject 47 exhibiting enhanced vocalization patterns, neural activity, critical threshold, recommend evaluation. The voice screamed my name for the next 4 hours. They didn't evaluate him. They didn't terminate him. They just let him continue, day after day, and I sat outside his door and recorded his decline. By week 7, he wasn't speaking words anymore, just sounds, wet and bubbling, punctuated by impacts against the door. The slate showed his vitals deteriorating, heart rate erratic, respiration failing. On day 53, the vitals flatlined. The sounds stopped. They removed the body the next morning, and by evening, a new subject occupied cell 47. I requested a transfer. Dulaine looked at me with those exhausted eyes and said, "To where?" He was right. There was nowhere to go. The facility was the assignment. The assignment was indefinite. Refusal was termination. And termination here didn't mean a bullet. It meant reclassification. I'd seen the intake logs. I knew where the subjects came from. Guards who broke protocol. Reassignments who asked too many questions. Anyone who failed to meet the facility's standards of compliance. I stopped requesting anything. Week 9. They introduced new procedures. Enhanced observation protocols, they called them. And we were issued injectors, thin needles loaded with a pale amber fluid, and instructed to administer them to subjects displaying specific symptom clusters. The injections weren't sedatives, they were accelerants. I watched through the observation window as a subject in cell 29 received the injection, watched the way his body convulsed, watched the way his skin split along lines that hadn't existed moments before. The slate recorded it all. I wrote it all down. Mayen refused to administer her injection. They dragged her away during the shift change. Her cell was empty the next day. 3 days later, I saw her through the observation window of cell 14, strapped to a surgical table, eyes wide and pleading. I looked away. I filed my report. I kept working. Week 11. Kess hanged himself in the dormitory. They cut him down. I logged the incident and assigned his post to someone else. Nobody spoke about it. Nobody spoke about anything. The dormitory had gone silent except for the sounds of breathing and the occasional muffled sob. At night, I lay awake and listened to the facility's ambient noise, the hum of ventilation, the distant clank of machinery, the occasional muffled scream from the sublevels below. I tried to remember what the sky looked like, what fresh air tasted like, what it felt like to believe I had a future. I couldn't. Week 13. They called me to Delaine's office. He sat behind a desk covered in data slates, his face gray and hollowed out, and gestured for me to sit. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied me with those exhausted eyes. Then he slid a slate across the desk. "Your performance has been exemplary," he said. "Consistent, reliable. You follow protocols without deviation. You don't ask questions. You don't break." He paused. "You're being promoted." I stared at the slate. The orders were already logged, already sealed with authentication codes I couldn't challenge. Effective immediately, I was being reassigned to supervisory duties. I would oversee a rotation of new reassignments, train them in observation protocols, ensure compliance with facility standards. Clearance upgraded to Amber 5. Quarters relocated to Sublevel 2. Duration: indefinite. "Congratulations," Dulaine said, and his voice was flat, empty. "You survived." I wanted to refuse. I wanted to scream, to overturn the desk, to run for the blast doors and tear them open with my bare hands. But I knew what refusal meant. I knew where it led. So I took the slate, nodded, and returned to my post to finish the shift. They moved me to sub-level 2 the next day. The quarters were larger, a private cell, a real bed, a desk with a lamp. It felt like a tomb. I reported to my new assignment and met the 15 reassignments I'd be supervising. They looked like I must have looked 3 months ago. Scared, confused, clinging to the belief that compliance would keep them safe. I gave them the same briefing Dulaine had given me. I told them the protocols. I told them not to ask questions. I told them not to let the subjects see them hesitate. One of them was Trooper Halleck. She didn't recognize me at first. My face had thinned, my hair had gone gray at the temples, and I'd learned to keep my expression blank. But when I called her name during roll check, her eyes widened, and I saw recognition flicker there, followed by something worse. Hope. I killed it immediately. I looked away, moved to the next name on the list, and continued the briefing. After the session, she tried to approach me, tried to speak, but I turned and walked away without acknowledging her. I couldn't afford hope. I couldn't afford connection. Those things were liabilities here, weaknesses that would get you reclassified. I assigned her to Cell 08. I wrote her shifts into the log. I observed her performance from a distance, noted her compliance, her silence, the way her hands shook when she filed her reports. She lasted 4 weeks before she tried to open a cell door. They dragged her to sub-level 3. I filed the incident report and trained her replacement. I've been on sub-level 2 for 6 months now. I don't count the days anymore. They blur together into an endless sequence of briefings and reports and observation logs. I train the new reassignments. I enforce the protocols. I ensure compliance. When someone breaks, I document it. When someone is reclassified, I assign their replacement. I am efficient. I am reliable. I am exemplary. Last week, they called me to the observation theater again. Another demonstration, another procedure, another subject strapped to a chair in a featureless cell. The voice over the speakers was different this time. Familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. It narrated the procedure with clinical precision, describing each step, each instrument, each expected outcome. The subject screamed. The drains overflowed. The voice never wavered. Afterward, I checked the archive logs, and the voice belonged to Proctor Dulaine. He'd been promoted to head researcher 2 months ago. I hadn't seen him since. Supervisory staff don't overlap with research personnel. But I'd heard the rumors. He'd volunteered for augmentation, for integration into the facility's systems, for a role that required absolute dedication. Now his voice was everywhere, synthesized and looped through every speaker, guiding every procedure, narrating every observation. He'd survived too. I sit in my quarters now, writing this on a slate a la race before the morning shift. The habit is dangerous, but I need to remember that I was something else once, that I had a name before I became a number, that I survived a war only to be devoured by the peace that followed. I need to remember Venn and Halleck and Kess, and all the others who passed through this facility and emerged as something less than human, or something more, depending on how the Imperium measures value. They're calling me back for another briefing tomorrow, another promotion, most likely. Enhanced responsibilities, greater authority, a deeper integration into the facility's structure. I'll accept because refusal isn't an option, and because some part of me, small, calcified, suffocating under the weight of protocols and observation logs, still believes that survival is worth something. But I know the truth now. I knew it the moment I read those reassignment orders 3 months ago, and I've watched it confirmed in every cell, every procedure, every subject who begged for mercy in a voice I recognized. The war didn't end. It just refined its methods. We didn't survive. We were simply processed more slowly. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake in this tomb they call quarters, is that I've become complicit. I've become the functionary on the platform, reading orders without meeting anyone's eyes. I've become the system that devours whoever stumbles, whoever hesitates, whoever dares to remember they were human once. The Imperium doesn't waste resources. And I am still, somehow, a resource worth preserving. For now. Until the day I break, or fail, or ask the wrong question, and they lead me down to sub-level 3 and strap me into a chair in a featureless cell. When that day comes, and it will come, because everyone breaks eventually, I hope I'm processed quickly. I hope I don't scream for long. I hope whoever sits at the monitoring station outside my door has learned the lessons I've learned, has built the same shell of numbness, has killed the same parts of themselves that I've killed. I hope they survive. Even though survival here is the worst fate of all.